It's February 1943, and somewhere deep in the Burmese jungle between the Chindwin and Irrawaddy Rivers, 300 men who aren't supposed to exist are about to make Imperial Japanese Army intelligence officers question everything they thought they knew about European fighting ability. These aren't your parade ground British troops. They're filthy, emaciated, covered in leeches and jungle saws, and they've been living off airdrops and whatever they can forage for weeks. They're Column 5 of the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, a mix of British infantry, Gurkha riflemen, Burmese scouts, and signals specialists carrying radios heavier than their packs. They're commanded by a half-mad British brigadier named Orde Wingate, who thinks he's reinventing warfare, and honestly, he might be right. But to understand why these 300 guys matter, you need to understand what had happened in the 10 months before they slipped across the Chindwin River in the dead of night. Let's rewind to December 1941. The Japanese military is riding the highest wave of confidence in its modern history. Pearl Harbor was 6 hours ago, and already their planners are mapping out the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere like they're arranging furniture in a house they already own. Their assessment of British military capability in Asia: absolute contempt, not just regular dismissiveness, institutional, doctrinal, printed in the training manuals contempt. Japanese staff officers had studied the British colonial system and concluded that it was fundamentally rotten. The British Empire in Asia was built on prestige and bluff, they argued, maintained by white men who'd grown soft in tropical luxury while native troops did the actual work. Japanese intelligence reports from late 1941 literally described British commanders as overfed, under-exercised administrators playing at soldier. The Japanese army had spent years fighting in China, Manchuria, and the brutal terrain of the Pacific. Their infantry doctrine emphasized light equipment, rapid movement through difficult terrain, and aggressive offensive action regardless of conditions. They developed tactics for fighting in jungle, swamp, mountains, and every miserable environment Asia could throw at them. The British? In Japanese eyes, they were trained for European warfare. Parade grounds, set-piece battles, massive supply chains, roads, railways. The Japanese looked at British forces in Malaya and Singapore and saw an army that would crumble the moment it had to fight on Japanese terms. And then, for 10 devastating weeks, that's exactly what happened. When Japanese forces invaded Malaya on December 8, 1941, the British defensive plan fell apart so fast it was almost difficult to watch. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita had 30,000 men for the invasion. British and Commonwealth forces defending Malaya numbered over 85,000. On paper, this should have been a disaster for Japan. In reality, it became the textbook example of everything Japanese military theorists believed about British weakness. The Japanese came down through the Malay Peninsula like they'd been born in the jungle, because many of them had trained in similar terrain for years. They used bicycles to move faster than British intelligence thought infantry could travel. They infiltrated through rubber plantations and swamp that British commanders had declared impassable. They landed amphibious forces behind British defensive lines, attacking from directions the defenders had assumed were impossible. British and Commonwealth units kept retreating, kept trying to establish defensive lines that Japanese forces would infiltrate around or through within hours. Officers trained at Sandhurst found themselves commanding troops who'd never trained for jungle warfare, using tactics that assumed roads and clear lines of sight and communications that actually worked in monsoon conditions. The disaster peaked with Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress, the Gibraltar of the East, the symbol of British power in Asia. It had massive coastal guns, a huge garrison, and fortifications that had taken decades to build. It fell in 7 days, February 15, 1942. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops to a Japanese force half that size. It was the largest capitulation in British military history, and it happened because Yamashita had done something British planners thought was impossible: attack Singapore from the north through the jungle in a direction the fortress wasn't designed to defend. In Tokyo, Japanese Imperial General Headquarters wasn't surprised. They were vindicated. Reports flowing back from the Malaya campaign confirmed every preconception. British officers had proven unable to adapt to jungle warfare. British troops had shown poor morale when fighting in tropical conditions. Commonwealth units had surrendered in situations where Japanese forces would have fought to the death. One intelligence assessment from March 1942 concluded the British Empire's military capability in Asia is negligible. European forces lack both the physical constitution and mental fortitude for sustained jungle operations. Native colonial troops fight adequately under European officers, but collapse when leadership is disrupted. Enemy retreat from Burma confirms that the British cannot maintain organized resistance in tropical theatre. That last part was important. By May 1942, British forces had retreated completely from Burma into India, abandoning Rangoon and everything west of the Chindwin River. It was the longest retreat in British military history, over 1,000 miles through some of the worst terrain on Earth. Japanese commanders watched British columns straggling into India, diseased, starving, having abandoned most of their equipment, and concluded the British were finished as a fighting force in Asia. Maybe they could defend fortified positions in India with overwhelming numbers, but offensive operations, jungle warfare, long-range penetration behind enemy lines. The Japanese assessment was clear: impossible for European forces. Lieutenant General Shozo Kawabe, commanding Japanese forces in Burma, told his staff in August 1942 that the British would need at least 2 years to rebuild their forces in India, and even then, they'd never be capable of the kind of aggressive jungle warfare that had won Japan its victories. The math seemed to support this. The British had lost over 30,000 troops killed, wounded, or captured in Burma. They'd lost hundreds of vehicles, artillery pieces, and virtually all their supplies. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases had devastated units that survived combat. The morale damage was incalculable. Meanwhile, Japanese forces in Burma were digging in, confident that the British threat from the west was neutralized for years. They focused on consolidating control, suppressing resistance, and preparing for operations against China. This was the context when a strange British officer with a biblical beard started training a unit that would do something Japanese intelligence had declared impossible. Brigadier Orde Charles Wingate was not a normal British Army officer. He was brilliant, abrasive, fanatically religious, and had a habit of receiving visitors while completely naked, brushing his body hair with a special brush he carried everywhere. He was also one of the only British commanders who'd spent the retreat from Burma thinking about offense instead of defense. Wingate had served in Palestine and Ethiopia, where he'd led irregular units behind enemy lines with unconventional tactics. He'd seen how small, mobile forces with good intelligence could wreak havoc on larger conventional armies, and he'd become obsessed with a simple question: what if you could operate deep behind enemy lines without any supply line at all? The conventional military wisdom was that this was suicide. An infantry unit needs supplies: food, ammunition, medical supplies, communications equipment. You need supply lines, depots, secure routes. Operating without these, especially in jungle terrain, would mean your force would starve or run out of ammunition within days. Wingate's answer was aircraft. Not close air support or air superiority, supply drops. What if you could have small, mobile columns that carried only what they needed for immediate operations and received everything else via airdrops at pre-arranged coordinates? You'd be completely independent of roads, railways, supply lines. You could go anywhere, strike anything, and disappear before the enemy could mass forces against you. British command in India thought he was insane. But by late 1942, after a year of unbroken defeats, they were desperate enough to let him try. The 77th Indian Infantry Brigade was formed in the summer of 1942. It wasn't a standard brigade. It was specifically organized for Wingate's concept of long-range penetration. 8 columns, each around 300-400 men, built around a core of British infantry with Gurkha riflemen, Burmese scouts who knew the terrain, Royal Engineers for demolitions, and RAF signals detachments to call in supply drops. Training was brutal. Wingate drove his men through jungle exercises in central India that simulated everything they'd face in Burma. River crossings, night marches, living off minimal rations, radio procedures, demolitions, small unit tactics. He stripped away everything standard infantry doctrine considered essential. Heavy equipment, gone. Tents, gone. More than a week's supplies, gone. Instead, each man carried a rifle, ammunition, a blanket, minimal rations, water purification tablets, and their share of column equipment. Mortars, machine guns, radios, demolition charges. The columns practiced moving silently through jungle, navigating by compass and map, establishing drop zones, and most importantly, avoiding large-scale combat. This wasn't about fighting Japanese divisions head-on. This was about infiltrating deep behind enemy lines, destroying infrastructure, disrupting communications, and forcing the Japanese to divert forces from the front lines to guard their rear areas. The Japanese had a word for this kind of warfare. They'd used it effectively in China. It was called special guerrilla tactics. They just didn't think Europeans were capable of it. February 8, 1943. Column 5, commanded by Major Bernard Ferguson, crossed the Chindwin River at night in local boats. They were 300 men disappearing into Japanese-controlled territory with no direct supply line, no safe retreat route, and orders to stay behind enemy lines for as long as possible, disrupting Japanese 15th Army supply lines between the Chindwin and Irrawaddy Rivers. For the first week, they moved through relatively sparse jungle, making decent progress. The column marched mostly at night, navigating by compass bearing, with Burmese scouts ranging ahead to avoid Japanese patrols. During the day, they'd establish a temporary camp in thick cover, post sentries and rest. The reality of jungle operations hit them immediately. Everything was wet: uniforms, equipment, ammunition. Leeches attached themselves constantly, requiring careful removal to avoid infection. The heat was suffocating during the day, and nights were cold enough that men shivered in their damp clothes. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes swarmed at dusk and dawn. And the noise. Every step seemed impossibly loud. Breaking through undergrowth, crossing streams, even breathing heavily, it all felt like it would give away their position. Japanese patrols could be 50 yards away, and you'd never see them through the vegetation. The first supply drop came on February 15th. Column 5 established a drop zone in a small clearing, set up coloured panels in pre-arranged patterns, and waited. At the scheduled time, RAF Dakotas appeared overhead and pushed out containers attached to parachutes, rations, ammunition, medical supplies, radio batteries, even mail from home. It worked. The system Wingate had designed actually worked. Men who'd been rationing their food suddenly had full bellies. Weapons that were running low on ammunition were restocked. The radios that connected them to air support and command had fresh batteries. But here's what made this different from anything the Japanese expected. Column 5 didn't stay near that drop zone. They moved immediately, covering miles before dawn, making it impossible for Japanese forces to locate them based on air traffic patterns. By late February, Column 5 had penetrated over 100 miles behind Japanese lines, deeper than any British force had operated since the retreat from Burma. And then they started breaking things. March 3rd, 1943. A Japanese supply train travelling from Wunto toward Indao carried ammunition, rations and medical supplies for forward units of the 18th Division. The line was supposed to be secure. The British were 200 miles away across the Chindwin, and local resistance had been suppressed. At 2 a.m, the train hit a section of demolished track and derailed. Before the shocked crew could react, automatic weapons fire erupted from the jungle. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. The attackers disappeared into darkness, leaving the train a burning wreck. Japanese forces from Wunto reached the scene by dawn. They found expertly placed demolition charges had destroyed 50 yards of track, cut telegraph lines, and damaged a small bridge. The attackers had clearly known what they were doing. These weren't amateur saboteurs, but who were they? Local resistance? Chinese infiltrators? The evidence didn't match. Shell casings were British .303 caliber. The demolitions used British pattern charges, and witnesses reported hearing English being spoken. This was impossible. British forces were in India. Intelligence had confirmed no major British units were even near the Chindwin River, let alone 150 miles beyond it in Japanese-controlled Burma. 4 days later, another rail line was hit near Bongyong. Then a Japanese supply convoy was ambushed near Bo. Then telegraph lines were cut in 3 locations simultaneously. Then a bridge over a tributary of the Irrawaddy was destroyed, forcing supplies to detour 40 miles. Each attack was small, a few dozen casualties at most, limited material damage. But the cumulative effect was spreading panic through Japanese rear areas. Officers who'd been told the British were defeated and incapable of jungle operations were now being told to guard every mile of railway, every bridge, every supply dump against an enemy that appeared out of nowhere and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Major General Hayashi Yoshihide, Chief of Staff for Japanese Burma Area Army, received reports throughout March that made no sense. British forces were operating in areas where British forces couldn't exist. They were surviving in jungle that should have killed them from disease and starvation within weeks. They were conducting operations that required training and coordination that defeated demoralized troops shouldn't possess. On March the 12th, a Japanese patrol near Bonchong actually found a Chindit camp, abandoned hours earlier, but the evidence was undeniable. British cigarette butts, ration tins with British markings, expended .303 brass, bandage wrappers with British medical supply stamps. And something that shocked Japanese intelligence officers: equipment drop zones marked with coloured panels, showing these forces were being resupplied by air. The British had somehow solved the fundamental problem of long-range jungle operations that Japanese planners had assumed was unsolvable without secure ground supply lines. March the 6th, 1943. Column 5 received orders to hit a major target: the railway bridge and viaduct at Bonchong Gorge. This wasn't a minor disruption. The Bonchong viaduct carried the main Mandalay-Myitkyina railway line across a deep gorge. Destroying it would cut Japanese supply lines to northern Burma for weeks, maybe months. But it was also guarded, and hitting it would announce the Chindits' presence in a way that couldn't be ignored. Major Ferguson's orders from Wingate were clear: maximum damage, then disperse and continue operations. The column approached Bonchong in small groups over 2 days, establishing observation posts to watch the bridge and identify Japanese guard patterns. The guards were regular infantry, maybe 30 men, with no indication they expected any threat this far behind the front lines. They were guarding the bridge the way you guard something as a duty, not because you expect it to be attacked. The demolition party, Royal Engineers with Gurkha security, moved into position on the night of March the 6th. The plan was surgical: kill or disable the guards quietly, place charges on the structural supports, blow the bridge, and disappear before reinforcements from the nearest garrison could arrive. It almost worked perfectly. The sentries were neutralized with knives and silenced weapons. the engineers placed over 100 pounds of plastic explosive on the bridge supports and the viaduct pillars. The charges were set with time delay fuses to allow the column to withdraw. At 11:30 p.m., the Bongshong viaduct exploded with a detonation that could be heard for miles. 2 spans of the bridge collapsed into the gorge, and a section of the viaduct was damaged beyond field repair. The railway line was severed. Column 5 melted back into the jungle before Japanese troops from Wunto could arrive. By the time reinforcements reached Bongshong, the attackers were 15 miles away, moving fast through terrain the Japanese considered impassable at night. The damage assessment reached Rangoon within 24 hours. Major railway disruption, estimated repair time 4 to 6 weeks, requiring engineers and materials from other sectors. The report also included something that made Japanese staff officers deeply uncomfortable. Enemy force estimated at company strength, demonstrating high proficiency in demolitions and jungle movement, origin and current location unknown. This wasn't guerrilla resistance. This wasn't Chinese infiltrators. This was a professionally trained British unit operating deep in the Japanese rear, and intelligence had no idea how many more might be out there. By mid-March, Column 5 had been behind enemy lines for over a month. They'd lost about 40 men, some to combat, more to disease and exhaustion, but they destroyed or damaged multiple railway installations, disrupted supply convoys, and forced the Japanese to divert over 1,000 troops just to guard rear area infrastructure. But they were also approaching their operational limit. Men were losing weight rapidly, surviving on airdropped rations supplemented by whatever they could scavenge. Malaria was spreading through the column despite the quinine tablets everyone took daily. Jungle sores refused to heal in the constant damp. Boots were disintegrating. Wingate's plan called for the columns to cross the Irrawaddy River, Burma's main geographical obstacle, and operate even deeper in Japanese territory, hitting targets in the Shwibo-Katha area. The Irrawaddy in March was a mile wide in places, running fast with mountain runoff. Crossing it with 250 exhausted men, all their equipment, and no boats was supposed to be impossible. Column 5 reached the river near Iniwa on March the 16th. Ferguson's scouts located a small village with fishing boats, enough to ferry the column across in multiple trips if they could do it without alerting Japanese patrols. The crossing took 2 nights. Small groups of men moving silently in darkness paddled across in boats that seemed impossibly fragile for the task. Equipment was wrapped in ground sheets to keep it dry. The radios, critical for calling supply drops, were handled like religious relics because if they got soaked, the column was finished. By March 18th, Column 5 was across the Irrawaddy, operating in territory that Japanese intelligence maps marked as secure rear area, no significant enemy presence. They demolished another railway bridge near Kiaikthin. They ambushed a truck convoy carrying ammunition. They cut telegraph wires that connected Japanese divisional headquarters to forward units. Each action was small. Each action by itself was militarily insignificant. But the cumulative psychological effect on Japanese forces was massive. Officers who'd been assured the British were defeated were now being told to assume enemy presence anywhere. Supply routes that had been considered safe now required armed escorts. Communications had to be verified because lines were being cut regularly. Rear area units that had been comfortable were now jumpy, firing at shadows, seeing British infiltrators everywhere. Major General Shinichi Tanaka, commanding the Japanese 18th Division, sent an increasingly frustrated series of reports to Burma Area Army Headquarters, demanding to know how many British units were operating behind his lines, where they were being supplied from, and why intelligence had failed to detect their infiltration. The answer, that a single understrength column of 250 men was causing this much disruption, was almost too embarrassing to admit. Here's what actually made the Chindits effective, and it wasn't what Wingate's publicity machine later claimed. Column 5 and the other Chindit columns weren't superhuman jungle fighters. They were desperately uncomfortable, constantly hungry, often sick British and Indian soldiers doing one of the hardest military jobs imaginable. Mortality from disease was horrific. Some columns lost more men to malaria, dysentery, and scrub typhus than to enemy action. The strategic value of the damage they inflicted was also limited. They didn't destroy any critical targets that fundamentally changed the Burma Campaign. The railways they disrupted were repaired. The supplies they destroyed were replaced. From a pure military effectiveness standpoint, Operation Longcloth didn't achieve decisive results, but that completely misses the point. What the Chindits proved was that the Japanese assessment of British jungle fighting capability was fundamentally wrong. European-led forces could operate effectively in the jungle. They could survive behind enemy lines without ground supply lines. They could conduct sophisticated operations in terrain the Japanese had assumed would defeat them. The psychological impact was enormous on both sides. For British and Indian forces that had retreated from Burma in defeat, the Chindits proved they could fight Japanese forces on equal terms in the jungle. Morale across Commonwealth forces in India improved measurably after news of Chindit operations spread. For Japanese forces, it shattered the assumption of inevitable superiority in jungle warfare. Intelligence assessments after March 1943 had to account for the possibility of British long-range penetration operations anywhere in Burma. Resources had to be diverted to guard rear areas. The comfortable assumption that the British were finished as an offensive threat was gone. One Japanese staff officer's report from April 1943 read, "Enemy has demonstrated unexpected capability for sustained jungle operations. Previous assessments of British tactical limitations require comprehensive revision. Defensive measures for rear area security must be expanded significantly." That's not the language of an army expecting easy victory. That's the language of an army that's been forced to respect an opponent it had written off. By early April 1943, the surviving Chindit columns were ordered to withdraw to India. They'd been behind enemy lines for over 2 months, far longer than the original plan. The retreat was brutal. Japanese forces, now fully aware of British presence and determined to destroy these units, hunted the columns aggressively. Men already weakened by disease and malnutrition had to march 200 miles back to India through territory the Japanese now controlled. Column 5 lost another 60 men during the withdrawal, some killed in combat, some captured, many who simply collapsed from exhaustion and disease and couldn't continue. Major Ferguson led the survivors back across the Chindwin River in late April. Of the 300 men who'd crossed in February, fewer than 180 made it back, and of those, only about 100 were fit for any kind of military service in the next 6 months. Across all 8 Chindit columns, the casualties were staggering. Of approximately 3,000 men who entered Burma, about 2,200 returned. But of those returnees, over 600 were so debilitated by disease that they required immediate hospitalization, and many never fully recovered. From a traditional military analysis, Operation Longcloth was a disaster. 30% casualties, massive medical attrition, minimal strategic gains, and no territory captured. But Churchill understood something the traditional analysts missed. He made sure that Chindit operations received massive publicity in British and American press. Photos of bearded, hardened jungle fighters, stories of daring raids behind enemy lines, tales of British forces out-guerrillaing the Japanese in their own jungle. The propaganda value was immense, but more importantly, it changed the narrative. Britain wasn't a collapsing empire that had been driven out of Asia forever. British forces could learn, adapt, and fight effectively in any environment. The defeats of 1942 weren't inevitable results of British racial inferiority in jungle warfare. They were the result of being unprepared for a specific kind of combat, a problem that could be fixed with training, tactics, and determination. In Tokyo, Operation Longcloth forced a comprehensive reassessment that Japanese commanders desperately didn't want to conduct. Through late 1943 and into 1944, Japanese intelligence reports on British capability changed fundamentally. The dismissive contempt was gone, replaced by cautious respect. One assessment from August 1943 concluded, British forces have developed specialized units capable of sustained operations in jungle terrain. Long-range penetration tactics demonstrate sophisticated coordination between ground forces and air supply. Enemy morale and combat effectiveness in tropical operations has improved significantly since 1942. Defensive planning must assume enemy capability for offensive operations throughout Burma theatre. That's a complete reversal from the March 1942 assessments that declared British jungle warfare capability negligible. More importantly, the Chindit operations influenced Japanese strategic planning. Resources that might have been used for offensive operations against India instead went to securing rear areas in Burma. Infantry divisions that could have been deployed to the Pacific instead found themselves guarding railways and supply depots against possible British infiltration. By late 1943, when Japan was desperately stretched across the entire Pacific theatre, having to divert troops to guard against Chindit-style operations was a strategic cost they couldn't afford. The second Chindit expedition in 1944 was much larger, about 9,000 men flown directly behind Japanese lines in gliders and transport aircraft. It tied down an entire Japanese division and disrupted operations during the critical period when Japan was attempting its own invasion of India through Imphal and Kohima. The Japanese offensive failed in part because supply lines through Burma were constantly harassed and disrupted by Chindit operations that shouldn't have been possible according to 1942 intelligence assessments. Here's where this story connects to every other story of military underestimation in history. The Japanese made the exact same mistake in Burma that the Luftwaffe made over Britain, that the United States made in Vietnam, that the Soviet Union made in Afghanistan, that Russia made in Ukraine. They looked at past performance, British defeats in Malaya and Singapore, and assumed that performance was permanent. They looked at their own advantages, jungle warfare experience, aggressive tactics, high morale, and assumed those advantages were insurmountable. They built an entire strategic assessment on the assumption that their opponents couldn't learn, couldn't adapt, and couldn't develop new capabilities. The Chindits weren't superhuman. They were soldiers who'd been given specialized training, unconventional equipment, and leaders who thought creatively about what was possible. Many of them had been part of the units that retreated from Burma in 1942. They'd experienced defeat, learned from it, and come back different. That's what Japanese intelligence never accounted for. The possibility that a defeated enemy might learn faster than a victorious one. When you're winning, there's no pressure to innovate. The tactics that worked yesterday will probably work tomorrow. Why question success? When you're losing, innovation isn't optional, it's survival. The British in 1942-43 had to completely rethink jungle warfare because the old methods had failed catastrophically. That desperation produced Wingate's long-range penetration doctrine, which was unconventional, risky, and based on technology, air supply, that hadn't been proven at scale. The Japanese, meanwhile, stuck with what had worked in 1942. Their jungle tactics didn't evolve significantly because they didn't think they needed to evolve. Why fix what isn't broken? That's the institutional arrogance that kills armies. Not the arrogance of individual soldiers, but the arrogance of organizations that assume current success predicts future outcomes. Let's be clear about what Column 5 and the other Chindit columns actually accomplished versus what the mythology claims. They didn't win the Burma Campaign. That required 3 more years of conventional operations, massive Commonwealth and Chinese forces, and horrific casualties at battles like Imphal, Kohima, and Meiktila. They didn't inflict decisive damage on Japanese military capability. The infrastructure they destroyed was repaired, the supplies they interdicted were replaced. What they did was break an assumption. They proved that British forces could operate in the jungle behind enemy lines for extended periods, achieving tactical objectives despite supposedly insurmountable environmental challenges. That proof mattered more than any single bridge they demolished. It mattered to British and Commonwealth morale across the entire theatre. It mattered to Churchill's ability to argue that Britain was still relevant in the Pacific War, not just a junior partner depending on American forces. It mattered to the millions of Indian soldiers serving under British command, showing that European leadership could adapt and learn. And critically, it mattered to Japanese planning. After Longcloth, every Japanese operation in Burma had to account for possible British long-range penetration. Every supply route needed guards, every rear area needed security forces, every commander had to assume that British forces might appear anywhere, anytime. That's thousands of Japanese troops deployed on guard duty instead of offensive operations. That's planning time wasted on security measures instead of attacks. That's psychological pressure on rear area units who'd been told they were safe. One understrength column of 250 men couldn't defeat the Japanese 15th Army, but they could make that army question its fundamental assumptions about British capability. And in warfare, forcing your enemy to question their assumptions is sometimes worth more than territorial gains. Every military generation since 1943 has studied the Chindits. The US military's long-range reconnaissance patrol units in Vietnam were directly influenced by Chindit doctrine. Modern special operations theory owes a debt to Wingate's concepts, but somehow we keep missing the broader lesson. The lesson isn't small units can achieve disproportionate impact behind enemy lines. That's tactics. The lesson is never assume your enemy cannot learn, adapt, and develop capabilities that surprise you. The Japanese in 1942 looked at British defeats and assumed permanent British inferiority in jungle warfare, exactly the same way the Luftwaffe looked at early RAF tactics in 1940 and assumed permanent RAF inferiority in air combat. Both were wrong because both made the fundamental mistake of assuming their opponents were static. They thought, this is who they are, this is how they fight, they will never change. Humans change, organizations learn, defeated armies study their failures and sometimes, not always but sometimes, emerge stronger because they were forced to innovate. The Chindits weren't better jungle fighters than Japanese infantry on an individual level. Japanese soldiers had more experience, better natural immunity to tropical diseases, and tactics refined through years of Asian warfare. But the Chindits had something more important: institutional desperation that drove innovation. They had radios that worked in jungle conditions because they'd figured out how to keep them dry. They had supply procedures that worked because they'd practiced them obsessively. They had navigation skills that worked at night because they'd trained in similar terrain for months. None of this was genius. It was just the hard, unglamorous work of learning from failure and refusing to accept that defeat was permanent. That's what the Japanese missed. They saw British failure in 1942 and assumed it would continue forever because it confirmed what they wanted to believe about European racial inferiority in Asian warfare. Confirmation bias in military intelligence isn't just dangerous, it's lethal. When you're looking for evidence that confirms what you already believe, you'll find it. You'll miss everything that contradicts your assumptions until reality forces you to pay attention. For the Japanese, reality came in the form of 250 filthy, half-starved British and Indian soldiers. who emerged from the jungle having survived where they weren't supposed to survive, fought where they weren't supposed to fight, and succeeded where they weren't supposed to succeed. Those 250 men didn't win the Burma Campaign, but they shattered the assumption that British forces were finished in Asia and that shift in perception mattered more than a dozen tactical victories. Major Bernard Ferguson, who commanded Column 5 through those brutal weeks behind Japanese lines, wrote something years later that captures the real significance of Operation Longcloth. He said, "We didn't defeat the Japanese in 1943. We just proved they could be fought. For an army that had retreated 1,000 miles in defeat, that was everything." That's the story behind the title. Japanese High Command thought Britain would fall in 1942, not just militarily, but psychologically. They thought British forces would accept that they couldn't fight in Asia, couldn't match Japanese jungle expertise, couldn't recover from the disasters of Malaya and Singapore. A tiny jungle unit of 250 men proved them wrong, not by winning decisively, but by surviving, adapting, and demonstrating capability where the enemy had assumed only failure was possible. In the end, that's what broke the myth of Japanese invincibility in jungle warfare. Not a massive conventional victory, but the quiet, unglamorous proof that British forces could learn, endure, and fight effectively in the environment where they'd been declared incompetent. The Chindits paid a horrific price for that proof, 30% casualties, with many survivors physically broken by disease and exhaustion. But they accomplished something that no conventional offensive could have achieved in early 1943. They changed the narrative from inevitable British defeat to uncertain outcome. And in warfare, uncertainty is sometimes the first step toward victory. That's the lesson from the Burmese jungle in 1943. Not that small units can achieve miracles, but that human beings can learn from disaster, adapt to impossible conditions, and force their enemies to respect capabilities they thought would never exist. The Japanese High Command learned that lesson the hard way, exactly the way the Luftwaffe learned it over England in 1940. Exactly the way every arrogant military force learns it eventually. You can have better equipment, more experience, and a track record of victories. But if you assume your enemy cannot change, you've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Those 250 men in the Burmese jungle, sick, exhausted, operating with minimal supplies in enemy territory, made the Imperial Japanese Army question its assumptions. Sometimes that's the most important victory you can win.